Thank you, Greg, for centering us. And thank you, Jency, for the slides. Let us close our eyes now as we prepare to center for this evening. Gracious Holy One, we invite you into this space as we call on the name of our ancestors to stir the waters as we prepare to talk about truths, as we talk about lives, as we talk about pain, as we talk about suffering. But in the midst of all of these things that are conjured in this pot, we know that we are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses that let us know that there is hope. So as we come into this space to share our stories, to tell our truths, we ask, O Heavenly One, Creator of all, that you temper our hearts, that you give us strength, that you give us endurance, and that you give us ear to hear. Give us an opportunity to be astute listeners as we seek to learn how to live one with the other in a beloved community. Help us to center ourselves in the very depths of our hearts as we begin to pour out our souls. For healing is what we're asking for now. Safe space is what we need now. Reconciliation is what we're asking for. And atonement is what we need, so that all of us, my sisters and my brothers, can be free and enjoy the freedoms of this world. For this world is created in a sense of abundance and greatness. We all have gifts and talents because you, the Creator, built it in us to be one. We invite you, O Holy One, into this space. We invite you into this space. We invite you into this space. Ashe, and amen.
Amen. And thank you so much, Reverend Glency, for a wonderful prayer to open up our work this evening. My name is the Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, and I'd like to welcome you all to this pilot hearing for the Reimagine America Project, Truth, Reconciliation, and Atonement Commission of Charlotte. As we come together tonight, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we're trying to do as a commission. RAP Track, or the Reimagine America Project, Truth, Reconciliation, Atonement Commission of Charlotte, is a grassroots community-led effort to say that we have waited too long for the conversation about race in America. Over the years, we've gotten rid of slavery, but we've kept race and got Jim Crow. We've gotten rid of Jim Crow and separate but equal, but kept race and gotten the war on drugs and mass incarceration. We've begun to work against mass incarceration and kept race and gotten a new supremacist movement that said it was going to make America great again. We believe that the time has come to stop responding to instances of racism with minor tweaks in a broken system. No, we need to dig out the root of racism, and that is the concept of race itself. You see, the concept of race is the notion that there is a human hierarchy of better or worse types, where some with lighter skin are given more wealth and power and privilege, and those with darker skin are forced to live with their backs against the wall. Race began as a way of taking people from land and land from people, legitimating why some people were born to lead and others were born to serve. Race only serves to undermine the possibility of equality. We cannot at the same time be a nation that holds these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal, and a nation that believes that we are separated by the color of our skin and the shape of our body or the kink of our hair. That we are somehow or another different in intelligence and in character. That we are somehow or another different in the way that we are valued as human beings. No, we must change our system if we are to live up to the exceptional ideals upon which our nation is built. Today, we are beginning our work with an initial examination of two of the systems in Charlotte that have a significant impact on the African American community. We'll look at policing and the court prison system. During our time together tonight, we will hear from three different types of witnesses. Number one, we will begin by hearing from two historical witnesses who will talk about policing in Charlotte and some of the problems inherent with this system. Then we will hear and spend the majority of our time hearing from three impacted witnesses who will talk about their experiences with police and the criminal justice system. And we will end our time tonight hearing from a confessing witness who will share about how his eyes were opened as a judge to racial inequalities and what he's begun to do to foster systemic change. We hope that this will be an informative, honest, and sincere conversation that might help us to see why we can no longer allow ourselves to be divided along racial lines, or to assume that there is any validity to the concept of race. We all have a lot of work to do to overcome the lie that we've been told now for more than 401 years. That work begins tonight, and we need each and every one of you to work with us to foster a more just and equitable city, state, and nation. We wish to reimagine, renew, rebuild an America that lives up to its ideals. And we need each and every one of you to make this vision, this dream, a reality. As we start our conversation today, I want to just remind us of a few guidelines. Our goal is to listen deeply, uncritically to the voices of people whose stories we have not heard before, that we might begin to learn the way that race has undermined people's humanity. We are also here to hear firsthand the stories who are told by people who know, who've been impacted by, or who recognize their role in the perpetuation of this racialized system. They will each tell their own stories of where they fit in and how they participated in or have been impacted by a system that we know needs to change. I'm excited tonight to introduce to you our initial slate of commissioners who will serve on our hearing panel. Tonight, they include the Reverend Greg Gerald, whose beautiful music you heard at the beginning of our time together. Reverend Gerald is the head of QC Family Tree and also the co-chair of the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice. You'll also hear from a woman who says that she wears multiple hats, the founder of In the Key of We, and also the co-chair of the Charlotte Clergy Coalition for Justice, Reverend Glency Redrick. We'll also hear from the most recent past mayor of the city of Charlotte, Mayor Jennifer Roberts, Reverend Dr. Sheldon Shipman, the pastor of Greenville Memorial AME Zion Church, and you'll also hear a bit more from me as we go. I would like to introduce to you the former Assistant Chief of the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department, Ms. Vicki Foster. Vicki will speak to us a bit about the state of policing in Charlotte and some of the things that she's seen in her more than 25 years on the police force here. Let's take a look at what Vicki Foster has to say.
So I think that, most of us kind of know the history of policing and how the history of policing started, and that African-American officers, first of all, weren't even allowed on the force for many, many, many years. And then when they were not allowed to make arrests of Caucasian citizens, and they predominantly worked in African-American neighborhoods. So, policing started off with racism, and a lot of people wanted to be police officers in those days because of what the job consisted of. And so unfortunately, that history has passed down, throughout the years. And, of course, some people truly believe that it's still absolutely embedded within most police departments. And I will say there definitely is a component of that. I truly believe that most people today want to become a police officer because they do want to help people. But of course, we always have the few, just like you do in any other job, that don't necessarily join for the right reason.
So when we think about the rate of African Americans in policing, I've heard that even today in a city like Charlotte that has a fairly high percentage of African American population, that the number of police officers continues to lag in terms of African American representation.
Yes, it does. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, I will say African American community is not necessarily interested as much in law enforcement careers as in other careers. And of course, there are a lot of reasons for that. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is there are a lot of barriers in the way that throughout the years, previous chiefs have changed to kind of help make recruiting process a lot easier, meaning going out to places where are predominantly African-American, HBCUs, places where we can actually go and talk to people and really sit down and tell them about the job. But there were so many things in place that hindered African-Americans from becoming police officers. At one point in time, credit was an issue. And so our police chief from 9-10 years ago, Chief Moreau, he actually changed that to where, as long as you have a payment plan and you are working towards whatever it is that's going on with your credit, then, we can work with you. So as you can imagine, credit was one of those things that kept a lot of African Americans from being able to qualify for the job. So you have those barriers. And some of those things where people had used their credit, and gotten something in their name. And so those type things. So there have been barriers. And then on top of that, a lot of our African Americans don't feel like they go to college that they need to work at a police department. They don't really see policing as a professional profession. And so we've tried to change that, attitude and try to show, that we are a professional organization. And then, we have to be very honest about the things that have gone on across this country. And when people see that, and then they also don't see a lot of people that look like them in certain roles and on departments, it doesn't become a very welcoming place to them. So just between all the barriers, and there's a lot of other different barriers, there's a lot of, driving records and just associations, of people that you can't associate with. And you have some people that their whole family is somebody that we wouldn't allow you to associate with. And so we have to be real honest about, some of those things. But yeah, there are a lot of barriers in place for African Americans. And then also the fact that what's going on across the nation.
As I listened to former Assistant Chief Foster speak, I heard her emphasize that policing in general has its roots in a racialized system. She mentioned that not only was the origin of this profession tied to groups that were sent to capture fugitive enslaved people, but that there continue to be racist dimensions of contemporary policing. In this regard, she mentioned that the number of African Americans in police departments lags behind their representation in the larger population. We need to increase the welcome for African Americans to feel at home on the police rolls. So just one other question that came up as you were talking had to do with this notion of officers often giving different commands to Black people than they do to white folks, and people feeling as though their dignity is at risk. You mentioned something about an inherent fear of Black men. Tell me more about that.
Well, I think that, history has shown us that there is a form of inherent fear of African American males. And, just as an example of, and maybe it's just strength, I'm not sure what it is, but like the Atlanta case, for example. So you have two officers and you have, the one guy that had been in the car and had been drinking. And after the altercation started, he was literally tossing them two guys around like rag dolls. And these are people that, probably work out 4 and 5 times a week. And so I just think that there's a inherent fear. It's no different than, the Pharaoh case and, someone running at you that, that what they have nothing in their hands. So it's that fear of you're going to be able to overtake me. And so that is a fear that we cannot change. That's just not a fear that we'll be able to change. That's going to be something that someone else has to figure out within themselves. Why do I feel that way? And we also have to look at ourselves and say, what is our propensity as African Americans, to resist? So we do have to look at the things that people weigh. But yeah, there's an inherent fear of how African American men in particular respond with the police and correlate and how they talk and how they communicate. And that right there within itself sometimes leads to some of the things that we're seeing across the nation.
So white officers' inherent fear of Black men puts Black men at greater risk?
Well, I think anybody's fear of anybody puts you at a greater risk. If I don't want to engage with you for whatever reason, and I'm not talking about just communication, like if I want to keep my distance from you for whatever reason that is, whether it's he's 300 pounds and I'm 150 pounds, I think anytime that occurs and that fear sets in, I think that you're going to have things that happen that would not happen if that fear was not there. We all know how we act when we are fearful of something or a situation, and it does emotionally charge you. Yeah, and fair or unfair, it does.
So thank you for that. It's I don't quite know where to go at this point in time with that, because I think that it's a frightening notion to think that an officer's internal fear can put someone else at greater risk. How do we police that fear? How do we shift that attitude so that we can look at a white suspect, a Black suspect, all of them with the same lens? That's where I'd love to see policing go.
And I think that's where it's about relationships and getting to know people. Because if you only know people for what a particular group they think is either known for, or if African Americans are considered to be violent people, if you don't get to know people and you go upon what you see day in and day out, and I always like to remind people that, remember this, people don't call police for tea. Okay, so every call they go to every day is doom and gloom. Okay, nobody's calling you to come over because things are going great. And once you have been in this business for a long period of time, I think that you're going to have things that happen that would not happen if that fear was not there. I mean, we all know how we act when we are fearful of something or a situation. And it does emotionally charge you. it's very hard not to become jaded. So you think about, people that work in the same communities. You got some, they love the community they work in, would never want to leave. And then you got people that are in communities that every day someone's calling them a pig or calling them whatever and whatever. And you start to grow, you internalize it. You try to tell these officers, don't take it personal. But you know what? I think that's a lot easier said than done. And those are things that we oftentimes don't think about when someone's working 8 hours a day and every time they ride by, the finger goes up and all this other stuff that the public doesn't see. And it starts to taint your vision about a group of people. And it's hard sometimes for them to separate. Everybody is not like this group, or everybody's not like this individual. We're individuals. And I think that's where we struggle because of how policing is. And I think until people decide that getting to know each other is one of the key things, we're going to continue to struggle.
All right. Okay. So I heard Vicki Foster suggest that an inherent fear of African-American men contributed to the reactions of white officers to Black males. Race-based fear causes things to happen, as she said, that can put Black people's lives at risk. Until people decide that getting to know each other across the racial divide, we're going to continue to struggle in this way. There's much more that former Assistant Chief Foster said that describes things that she would like to do to reform policing, including standardizing policies across the nation, greater care for recruiting people with more careful examination of why people really want to do this job, and helping officers to remember at the end of the day that it is the community first, and the need to hire people whose heart is for the community, who will be held responsible to living up to a community first code. We also have coming to speak to us today as our second historical witness, the Reverend Dr. Peter Wary. Dr. Wary is the pastor of the Mayfield Memorial Missionary Baptist Church here in Charlotte. And he's recently joined the board of a group here in Charlotte appointed by the city council that's meant to help reevaluate the way that policing takes place here in Charlotte. Dr. Wary, I'd love to hear from you as you testify today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sadler. I'm honored to be a part of this discussion. And I want to just lift up a few things. The problem with this particular subject is crossing out enough things to be able to fit within the time we have. However, I'll say that this service opportunity spans several weeks into a few months, focusing on reimagining police and policing in Charlotte. And I served on the larger group, but also in a subgroup 4. And I can tell you, just as a spoiler alert, out of this engagement did come some very promising things, even as we look at many others that still need to take place. So the reason, I had a chance to sit a week ago, the 12th, in a private setting of the city council, where some of our ideas were thought through, and I concurred with some of the things some of the council people mentioned about making incentives for policing more attractive, that Charlotte be an employer of choice. But I agreed with that for different reasons than I think were perhaps in that room. I agreed because I know there is an inverse correlation between the level and sense of appreciation felt by officers and their propensity to engage in excessive violence in the performance of their duties. And so it is, I asked very pointedly of the council that this process, as positive as I think it has eventually been, not be tainted by a false equivalence, which elevates incentives for police to the same level of urgency as the pain of Black people and others of color, which has occasioned the angst and aggression in our streets. I will tell you that my own psychic pain almost dissuaded me from participating and accepting this opportunity, because I began to think through the fact that what occasioned the sea change that's happening in so many parts of the country I believe, was the close proximity of the deaths of Harold Easter here in Charlotte, January 26th of this year, Ahmaud Arbery, February 23rd, 2020, Breonna Taylor, March 13th, 2020, and George Floyd, May 25th, 2020. All this in Charlotte in the shadow still of the killing of Keith Lamont Scott on September 20th, 2013. It drove me, and now it's clear that it also drove the rest of the country into a very dire place. And so, as a practical theologian, I've learned over the years to listen in moments of stress. And I heard the blood of these citizens and others crying out to me from the ground that there may be no more fruitful time than now in our city and hopefully in our country to creatively and aggressively pursue substantive and operational change in the way Black life is treated. And in response to what former Deputy Chief Foster said, one cannot force anybody to value Black life, but one can certainly better manage the feral, malign, and ignorant impulses of violence against Black life by some people in power in our country, here in our city, including the broader culture of policing in America. So I wanted to lift up just a few things that our subgroup made prominently as forceful recommendations to the Safe Communities group on council. That first of all, we ought to require all future CMPD recruits to live within the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. And officers living immersed in the unique culture of a city, Charlotte has a unique culture, will have fewer opportunities to succumb to what I call suburban bias, which at times may be class-based as well as cultural, that is, racial. These same officers, I think our group concluded, will also approach their duties every day with a more concrete stake in the community they serve. And so with that backdrop, I think as many incentives as are feasible ought to be extended. At least that was our conclusion. Secondly, another thing we concluded is that there ought to be financial disincentives for officers to mistreat Black and brown people. For too long, there have been no meaningful sanctions personally levied against officers who mistreat and murder people. And of course, officers who are bad actors, we thought ought to be held more personally accountable than they have ever been or ever will be under the current regime of law. Fact is, our discussion concluded that officers who are bad actors may display more careful regard for life, even Black life, if they are certain to face some financial liability, since no legal liability is likely in the near future. This fear, so-called, of Black bodies from armed police officers notwithstanding. We concluded as well that the time has come for the entire posture and purpose of CMPD, our Charlotte police, at protests to evolve. And I'll just summarize this by suggesting that they ought never show up. And Dr. Sadler and I and others witnessed the transformation in temperature on a street when a flatbed truck of SWAT-clad police rolled up to a peaceful protest. They ought never show up in SWAT gear, and they ought to have bicycle lines never obstructing movement, but also they ought to be First Amendment protectors. They ought to be protecting the right of protesters to exercise that protected right of dissent. Our discussions also revealed that where there is interagency cooperation required to change something, that city council in our town ought to at least come out and full-throatedly endorse some things that they cannot immediately enact. And that may require the state legislature or the district attorney to implement, and that there ought to be a concrete plan for moving those ideas forward when that takes place. We finally, and there's so much more I could say, but perhaps in the Q&A, some of that can come out, Dr. Sadler, but we finally took a look at a peaceful protest and peaceful demonstrations. We took a look at the legal process, particularly we took a look at the misdemeanor and the felony level, but at the felony level. And we also took a look at the Civil Service Board and its potential cooperation the uh, with the um, with the Citizens Review Board. And so rather than take up too much time with a lot of detail that may come out in later discussion, I think I will end my comments there.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wary, both for your participation on this panel and for your testimony here tonight. I would like to ask you, as you go on, you've mentioned a number of changes in policy and changes in the direction of the police force. Do you believe that these changes will begin to shift the way that Black and Brown people are treated here in Charlotte? Do you believe that they will have a racial impact?
I'm cautiously optimistic about that. I really am optimistic more than cautious. Because one of the things that's going to happen in our CMPD, and of course, this is not telling tales out of school, but is a reformation, a reimagining as well in Charlotte of, instead of having the Cahoots program, for example, come in, we already have CPCRT group in CMPD, which has officers that are trained in de-escalation and mental health. But this will also involve now, for the first time, mental health professionals and counselors and social workers taking calls that involve people with perhaps presenting mental health issues, rather than marked police vehicles ever showing up to that call. I think that's one thing that's going to come out of this. One of the other things that's going to come out of this, I believe, is a reevaluation of youth programs in our city so that they are outcome based, and we support and give more resources to programs that we see and can track are really helping improve police relations and community policing and youth programs across the city. There will be policy changes. There have already been some. For example, that tear gas has been done away with. And I challenged personally the council to get rid of pepper spray. And so eventually other things will go by the wayside. Because factually on the receiving end of pepper spray, there's a distinction without a difference between that and tear gas. There will be budget adjustments at the same time to make sure that resources are funneled to programs that bring people and police together and that ameliorate conditions of suffering in the city. In summary, I think that's just a teaser of some of the things that are going to come out on October 26th in the council meeting. It's going to be a pretty comprehensive statement. I think I do commend our city for having walked and chewed gum at the same time. We haven't just fired some people and moved dollars around with broad strokes, blunt terminology like defund police, but we really have taken a thoughtful look at the comprehensive, holistic reimagining of policing in our city. And I believe good things are going to come out of it.
Well, thank you so much for that report. Thank you so much for what you're doing there. I believe that this is a good beginning. We, as Robert Frost said, have miles to go before we sleep, but at least we started this significant journey. Thank you so much. Our next speaker tonight is our first impacted witness. She is a longtime Charlotte resident. She is a mother. She is among the most significant activists I know in the city. Miko McCarthy is going to come and speak to us a bit. She'll first give her testimony, and then afterwards she'll receive questions from the Reverend Glency Redrick. And finally, after that, she'll have there'll be a statement that will be in response to what she said by Reverend Greg Gerald. Thank you so much, Miko. Welcome.
Hi, y'all gotta overlook me being in the car. I've been out doing canvassing and making sure we change the seat in the White House. So work don't stop.
I told you she was an activist, didn't I?
So work don't stop. So I just took a few minutes to jump on this call. So I'm glad to be here. I love a lot of the people here. My infamous mayor, Jennifer Rogers. So, Love you. But let me go ahead and get to the point. Back some time ago in 2011, my son Larico Williams was murdered by a CMPD officer. He was tasered. The officer that tasered my son received training 3 months before he actually murdered my son. And that's a big problem. So people can talk about training officers. It has nothing to do with it. It has something to do with training, but not all, because this officer received training and he took it upon himself to do what he wanted to do. And a part of the process of going through courts, um, he lacked respect for his own superior because it came out in testimony and through a deposition. He had an incident where he interfered in a pursuit, and his own superior requested for him to step down, and he declined. He testified himself that he was put on suspension for just 1 day, but to him, he was like, well, I kind of figured it was going to be a jump and run, and it was. So, okay, I got 1 day. So my point to that is, if you have an officer that's patrolling in the community that don't even have respect for his own superior to tell him to step down and do not continue to engage, because he don't really know what his superior may have seen, and he still disregard a command, that's a problem. Needless to say, some of the comments was very um, not acceptable or appropriate. Um, in no shape, form, or fashion. You had comments that was made that had profanity. One of my issues come from one officer by the name of Anthony Payne. He said some inappropriate things, and the fact that they both officers were like, "Oh, I thought he was faking." That's terrible, because if you don't know how to distinguish somebody faking from going in convulsions, you don't need a badge. And that's one major issue and concern that I've had through this whole process. And my son's case was treated as a homicide. You had Detective Ladden, Stephen Ladden, that was the homicide detective that was on the case, told me himself when I was at CMPD's headquarters, he said, regardless of what information we put together, good or bad, there's no district attorney um, in Mecklenburg County that's going to prosecute no police officers. And I was like, well, that's like a spit in the face. I say, so basically, this officer can get away with murder. He was like, no, 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 I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that no district attorney is going to prosecute. And as we can see, nothing has been done, period, at all. Then to come to find out through a federal court case that I had, that Connor versus Graham, a case here, has been the problem. Connor versus Graham, I guess, is a CMPD case. So CMPD been reckless for years. Um, it's no disrespect to Vicky Foster. I love Vicky Foster to death, but she's just one. And she can't be the face for everybody. When you put it in there, there's good officers, there are bad officers. It's a few that really want to impact the community and make change for the community, such as like Vicky Foster. But then you have some that they wake up, get in a car, drive an hour to purposely cause problems. I even heard an officer one time out doing a standoff. The standoff went real smooth. This particular officer was like, wow, I thought we was going to get some actions. I looked, and it made me look at policing very differently. Not just the fact of that comment, but the fact that there's really been no accountability with officers' actions. And I think if they start putting some of the liability on them, they'll think twice. Sheriffs will get terminated with no problem. CMPD, you have to go through hell and high waters to get an officer terminated. You have a chief, you have a city manager that really don't have no power. You have a civil service board, which is like a committee to me that should not make the determination whether officers stay or go. I don't think that's right. The purpose of us having a city manager is to manage. The purpose of us having a chief is for him to handle his people. So if you have a chief that make a recommendation for 67 officers to be terminated, and you have one particular committee that might be pro-police and don't care because it's not knocking at their doorstep, that's a problem. That's a serious issue. You have officers that feel like it's okay to tear people's property. Half the time they do it because they can't afford it. And they're mad because somebody else black is driving it. So they damage their properties. So, and they quick to say, we'll go to risk management. Then risk management makes the determination whether they're going to honor or whatever. But I feel like if an officer want to take the administrative approach and bust out a window or do any type of damaging the property, I think if CMPD start making some of that come out their personal checks, they'll think twice before they decide to go pick up the ass baton and bust out a window or damage somebody's car, because it's going to come out their pockets. And I think that'll be a good way for them to start doing collective data reporting. Because if you have an officer that don't mind no money coming out their check, then you need to really check that officer. So once you start shifting liability, you start seeing a change. You really don't see too much. You might with sheriffs. Sheriffs know how to do community engagement. They come out, even if they're serving warrants, they'll come out to a scene, and even if a person's upset, they're gonna have that conversation. Like, even if I leave, the warrant's not gonna go away. So they have different type of conversation. They do more communicating. A lot of these police officers here, they don't want to communicate. I'm 47 years old, and I'm not finna have no 25-year-old walk up on me and tell me to shut the F up, or, just do different things. No, we're not. My daughter is 30. So I'm not finna have nobody else's chaps disrespecting me. I don't care what their title is, period. And that's a problem. You get some, and then you have some of these officers that may have been on the force for a little bit, and they need to be strategic about who they two-man. Because if you got a cop that don't respect Black people, why would you want him to train somebody to train another racist? Because that's all you're gonna get. You're gonna, and you have issues with a lot of these fake traffic stops. Um, I've had this conversation before in a lot of different rooms. When you want to look at racial profiling, don't nobody think about the fact, I'm sorry, you guys, when you look at racial profiling, nobody thinks about the fact of that there's a situation where they look at it as color, and it's not about color. In reality, racial profiling is a little bit past color. Racial profiling goes as far as you have car profiling, you have culture profiling. And what I mean by culture profiling, if a person that have locks, cornrows, a box, afros, four dreadlocks, or just the wild looks, but it's culture, they're gonna get pulled over if they have a 30-day plate, if they have a nice car, if they have big rims, or even if they have no rims. But if they're in a nice car and they're Black and they have dreads, they're gonna find a way to justify the pinging, and it's a fake ping. They're gonna pull a person over, then it escalates. Because if a person's saying, "What are you stopping me for?" and you have an officer come up with something, they just dig something out the sky just to justify the contact. I had an officer do me like that. Um, it was a situation where a young guy, he was walking down the street, they pulled out guns on him, and I stopped and I pulled out my camera, recorded. And then they said that the guy fit a description or something, but then in the end, he wasn't even the person. It wasn't none of that. But it was just the way they handled the situation. So after me and a white girl was out there, she was recording, I was recording. She was like letting it be known. She didn't care nothing about what they had to say, nothing. But it was just interesting. I was to the side and I had my camera out. When I got ready to pull, the officer pulled behind my car. I still have the video footage too. He pulled behind my car. After he pulled behind my car, he waited for me to get ready to pull off, and then he wanted to get to the car and say, "Hey, can you stop for a minute?" I stopped in the middle of the street, and I was like, "What?" He was like, "Can I ask you a question?" I say, "Am I under arrest?" "No." "Do you need my license and registration?" "No." I said, "Well, what do you want?" "This is casual. This is a casual contact." I said, "Ain't nothing casual about this contact. I'm free to go." Yeah, I drove off. I don't do conversations. If any police officer want to have a conversation with me, they can schedule a conference or a sit down time with Karani Truzy with Crumley Roberts and Associates at any time, which is my attorney. And I let them know that at every time. Otherwise, it's nothing casual. One thing they did when it comes back, going back to my son's case, I had a major issue with the lack of respect that CMPD engage in. They're crooks. They're sneaky. Uh, they get away with too much. They shuffle paperwork. They trump charges. They put bogus charges on people. They do a lot. Um, my son, they put a fake case on my son and said that he was going to court the very next day after they murdered him for assault on a government official. It looked so tacky and so shabby the way it was put in the system. I took a picture of it, sent it to my attorney, and I say, "What is this?" And you can tell it's literally like somebody copied and paste a criminal court case and put it on the screen and just did it. And the only reason why they done it is because they know how the media are. They love to go grab a person's background and try to justify the action, which, like I've told them before, I say you love to try to get a story, but at what cost? Then you go back to that person and want them to have engagement with you and give you their story when you've been disrespectful. I say tacky coverage get you tacky outcomes. You'll get blackballed eventually. You'll get disrespected. You won't be able to cover a story, and nobody's going to do no collaborations or networking with you. So when you go around and you quick to grab a person's background to justify the situation, I don't care about what somebody did 5, 6, 17 years ago. I don't even care if a person did prison time. Just because they done prison time, they paid for the action. Who's to say that what they went to prison for was a legitimate action? That's just a charge. That's what they say. So, and it's a lot of people that are in prison right now for things that they haven't done, but you have district attorneys. Well, I take that back. We're going to say the ADAs. You have the ADAs. You have a few judges. Somebody's married to this one, from officers to ADAs to whatever their professional is. They shuffle work. They pack records. We know they pad records. I have evidence of an officer that just recently went to a girl's house, a little young girl. She's probably about 20 some years old. She called me frantic in the midst of a police officer coming to her house, act like he had a search warrant, didn't have a search warrant. She called me. I went down into her house. I took pictures of her door. I took pictures of the so-called warrant. It wasn't a legitimate warrant. It wasn't even nothing that a judge signed. It was an old charge. The person who was already processed and in custody for. So I took pictures of that, and I sent it somewhere. I got actively involved more with politics when my son passed because of the fact I seen so much corruption. When I seen how they allowed these police officers to get away with murder, um, it became a major problem to me. So that's how I got actively involved in the community to make change. And that's when I met Robert Dawkins. And at that point in time, we was doing a anti-discrimination bill. And he wanted to lobby the bill, and we went to Raleigh. And at that time, then I still had my attorney to meet me in Raleigh when I did the lobbying. I just played zero games. It's a lack of trust in the community when it comes to policing. Um, it's a lot that the community we are underserved, but we're flooded with officers. So you got to make sure you're understanding what I'm saying when I say we're underserved, but we heavily populated. See, it's a bigger difference to flood the community with a bunch of polices. But if we're not getting those services, it's not serving a purpose. You have all these. I was on the safety committee. Vicky Foster was on it too. Was on the safety committee. They gave me a whole list. Well, the committee, a whole list of different programs that they said they had. And they wanted to continue to fund them. And when I looked at them, it was so many programs I ain't never heard of in my life. And I said, well, where are these programs in the community? Where are these programs in the courtroom? Because when I've set up in the courtroom, I've never heard about none of these organizations. So we're going to talk about deferred prosecution to make somebody spend some money. Let's talk about these programs that you say that you got with a 99% success rate with urban people from empowerment, enrichment, all of this motivating, everything that sounds good. And like I told them, the numbers look real pretty, and no disrespect to nobody on the call. I just told him you have a white person that's a PR that seems like he noticed a lot of black people on there on the committee. And he know that some of them are activists and advocates. He knows some of them do utilize their social media platform, and they gave pretty numbers to look pretty to pamper. And like I asked, I'm gonna ask the questions that nobody wanna ask. I asked, well, who are you serving? At-risk youth, scholar kids? Who are you serving? Because I ain't never heard of these programs. I don't see no police officer going when you go arrest somebody, when you go stand up in their court. Only thing you doing is talking to the district attorney how to criminalize and continue mass incarceration. You're not talking about these mentoring programs that you say has a 99% success rate for with black people. I haven't heard of them. They're not implementing them in the courtroom. They're not saying, hey, why don't you go there? They're not doing it through the kids that are going through since we have raised the age. I don't see them going into the juvenile saying, hey, we got a program. We have a list of this, a list of that. You don't hear about it. But it's interesting that they want the money. But what are we funding? Are we funding someone else's economics as far as how they live? I mean, I don't see nobody really benefiting from these programs. It's just a lot of different things that I have issues with when you really technically look at a lot of different things when it's coming to police. One thing, and maybe Vicky Foster can come back, maybe piggyback up on this, or maybe answer this question. An officer told me that Vicky wrote a lot of the policy. So with Vicky Foster writing a lot of the different policies, I guess when they did a lot of modifications and changing through whatever the policies, a lot of the policies that they go by. Um, I'm just curious to the fact what incidents or what casualties occurred which made them feel like they wanted to tweak. One other thing is a lot of times they reference the cases that an officer have committed. So like my son, he's in the training. They would never let neither one of my kids join the police academy. See, it's interesting. Let me go back. When they murdered my son, they asked for a list of all the family members. As they say, they wanted a list of the family members to determine the loss. There's nothing to determine. The determination was determined when we had a body. Names don't justify. It was a way just to harass. It was a way to, in a sense, blackball. And because there was civil litigation, but no criminal litigation, and it was mind-boggling that I had an all-white jury so that he wasn't tried by any of Rico's peers, my son's peers, because nobody black was on there. They got mad at one lady because she said she looked at cops and put her off. They took another black person off, say because she had eviction. I don't understand what her eviction had to do with her serving jury duty. But it was an all-white jury, and they said that he used excessive force. So I don't understand here today why he still has a badge. They also have in their policy, their loyalty system or something like that. Well, it's interesting that you have that in writing, but you had Michael Forbes got impeached. We used his deposition to impeach him. So he still has a badge. So not only did he murder somebody, he also committed perjury under oath. So when you sit back and you say that you have a policy that's built off honesty and loyalty, what loyalty? What honesty? Because we know he was impeached.
So, Ms. McCarthy, I want to stop you right now, just sort of in the interest of time, and I hate to stop you because there's so much more that we could definitely mine from your testimony. Just wanted to find out if Reverend Glency Redrick had a question that she'd like to ask of you, and then I'd like to hear from Reverend Greg Gerald to just sort of give us a sense of what you heard from Ms. McCarthy as she spoke.
First, I want to say, Miko, thank you for sharing your soul and your heart story with us this evening. I'm sure many of us probably are feeling a sense of anger and disappointment. And knowing that you have bared your soul, I have one question that I would like to ask, given everything that you shared, and that would be, what, in your opinion, do white people need to understand the most in working to dismantle racism? Because most of what I heard shares with us the system of racism that is embedded within our law enforcement system within the CMPD.
I think it should be mandatory. I know they make judges take those interpersonality tests. I think it's an option, but I think they should make it a requirement. Because if you have a police officers, because it'll show what color they're going to be more prejudiced to. And I feel like if it's an option, you're not going to find the truth. The same way they allow police officers to carry a taser, but they told me that a lot of officers won't sign a waiver to get hit with a taser. So, and I find it interesting that they used to be quick to pull out a taser and use a taser, but you mean to tell me they didn't want to get hit with a taser? It's like, yeah, it's hard to get them to sign a waiver saying that, you know, if anything happened, them or their family won't do anything. That's very interesting. So they don't want it used on them, but they want to go in the Black community, point it as a gun and taser people and kill them. That's
Okay.
disturbing.
Thank
So
you.
the interpersonality test would be one way, I think, but also they can't. To me, if you're gonna patrol in an urban community, you need to know how to engage that urban community. You cannot go in that particular community hostile. You can't go in there trying to belittle or degrade nobody. You know, it's not gonna happen because that's testosterone against testosterone, and then there's color against color, and nobody's going to allow nobody of another color to just disrespect them. I don't think nobody is. It doesn't matter what the color is.
Okay, thank you so much for that. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the North Carolina criminal justice and law enforcement system, what would that be?
Oof. Um, you have a pen so you can write it down?
I sure do.
Okay. So we're going to say starting off with the racial profiling. You look at the car profiling, 30-day plate profiling, culture profiling. That will fall up under racial profiling. Um, the fake, actually the trumped up marijuana charges. When they charge a person of color up to an ounce to a half an ounce, even if they have maybe a joint, they're going to still get an excessive charge. Versus someone of another color of Caucasian will get a citation and that's it. So I would say all of those right there, if you take away all of those, the racial profiling, the culture profiling, um, the car profiling, the 30-day, the excessive marijuana charges, then I will ask you the question of what traffic stops would we really have?
Okay. Thank you for that wish, and I did write it down.
Thank you so much. Thank you both so much. Reverend Gerald.
Ms. McCarthy, thank you so much for the way that you have shared with, I've seen the word candor in the chat, and I think that's a perfect word, the way that you have absolutely just offered us something from your soul. And so there are a couple things that I just wanted to reflect back, and if I don't get them right, then you can correct me. Feel free to. But as far as the emotional content of what I heard, there's a lot happening. I heard your grief, I heard your courage, your profound courage, and I heard your rage. And I just want to acknowledge all of those things as being so important for us to hear and to bear witness to. I heard the way that multiple different levels of systems have failed you and have failed your son. And so that begins with the police department here, and that even if the police department had policed itself, they couldn't have found a district attorney who would have done anything about it. And the Civil Service Board is empowered by the state. And so at a state level, we've failed you as well. And for all those multiple systems to have failed, it just really is a travesty of justice. I also heard you mention many times just the importance of respect and the way that words from police officers added on to the trauma that you were already experiencing. The way that they spoke about your son, the way that officers have spoken to you personally or to other of your children or family members or loved ones, and the lack of cultural awareness that officers, especially white officers, bring into Black neighborhoods, and the way that that lack of cultural awareness looks like and often is, in actuality, lack of respect, and how that furthers the already difficult situations that so many of our Black neighbors are facing. And I also heard, and this is the last thing I want to say for now, that what's happening with our police department and our Black neighborhoods in particular, and your family in particular also, is the shifting of liability. So an officer gets to act however the officer wants to act without bearing any personal liability for that, or without the system being liable for that behavior. It is Black people, especially, that bear the liability for the way that officers act, up to including the death of people. That is unjust. It is not fair. And I thank you for sharing the way that that has impacted you. I hope that this can be another step in the way of changing that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes.
Thank you.
If I can respond back,
Please.
just going back, you summed it up pretty good. But I would just want to just say this: when you're looking at the communicating, I just find it very disturbing that with my son taking his last breath, I have to see a police officer purposely drive his car past to purposely not catch anything. That was disturbing, because the purpose of your dash cam is protection for the officer as well as the person that he's engaging. It captures the truth of what's currently going on.
Mhm.
But the biggest issue that CMPD have, they want to be movie directors. They act like they do a casting call. They do cutting, editing, they alter. They did that in my son's case. That came out. His 15 minutes of audio was missing. I still have anything that anybody want to get from my son's case. I have no problem giving it to you. I went to every deposition. My attorney looked at me and said, Miss McCarthy, you know you don't have to come. I said, I haven't even had a chance to grieve. I say, but I got to be my son's voice from the ground up. Because for me to hear a police officer out there on the scene when this other police officer murdered my son, they come out and say, oh, you got tasered. Excuse what I'm about to say. His exact words verbatim was, oh, you got tasered, you shithead. I bet you that shit hurt. That's very tacky. And even the federal court judge stated and looked at the city's attorney, Newbold, Daniel Peterson, and Lori Keaton, which she was representing Michael Forbes. Daniel Peterson represented the city. Newbold just oversee what was going on. They looked at him. The judge say, I hope that y'all done something about that, because we don't have time for no police officers out there acting like we in the wild, wild west. And they say, if you ain't done nothing, I hope y'all have done something, or y'all gonna do something. He said, because that's unacceptable.
Amen.
That came from a federal court judge.
Yeah.
Amen. And I'm glad that at some point in time, the system recognizes the problems in the system itself. So thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. McCarthy. Thank you so much for your, as Reverend Gerald said, your honesty. And thank you, Reverend Gerald and Reverend Redrick, for your questions and your summary. I'd like to call our next impacted witness, a young man who's been involved in the criminal justice system, who's seen the ins and outs of policing here in Charlotte, and who has been able to redeem his life after a considerable struggle throughout this process, Mr. Arkevius Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong will have questions asked of him by Reverend Dr. Sheldon Shipman, and Mayor Jennifer Roberts will offer a opportunity to listen and respond to his testimony. Mr. Arkevius Armstrong, I ask that you would take the next 7-10 minutes to share your thoughts and your testimony, after which we will begin to ask questions of you.
I was a young man who struggled again with trying to find my way, trying to find my identity. And, you know, with having the many issues that I had coming up, it wasn't to me by surprise that, you know, I saw a lot of young men like myself. And again, I had my brothers, I had mothers, my father who was also going in and out the system. And so coming from an environment where, you know, the violence was very high, you know, I mean, the drug activity was very high. And you know, you saw it. You saw police brutality. You saw police wrongfully just pulling people over just because they come down a certain street. You saw police drawing their guns on people who were just standing or sitting in front of the yard, just gathering and having. I mean, you saw all of these things as a young kid. I used to see on a day-to-day basis where, you know, you can be standing outside playing and 10 police officers might run up from out of the path, you know, and just get everybody on the ground and put guns to the back of their heads. I've also, as a young man, I witnessed my mom on 2 different occasions. You know, at the time she was struggling with her drug addiction, but I saw my mom on 2 different occasions been drugged out of a house and a shotgun pointed to the back of her back. And, you know, as a young man, I think I had to be no more than like 7 or 8 years old playing outside to witness that. It was traumatizing. And so what we have in what we see in today in society, and, you know, it's not to point the finger at everybody, but at the same time, we have to address the elephant in the room. What we see is young people of color are emotionally traumatized, psychologically traumatized, and fed up, tired, and sick and tired and looking for something to change. And me personally, I understand the frustration because I witnessed it. I understand the pain because I also endured it. And I understand it from a aspect of the fear of many officers that aren't like that, but those who are the officer that single people out, target people, wrongfully plant things or pull people over or stereotype or whatever the case may be. It looks bad on all the officers. And so, you know, the whole department get a bad rep for a few bad apples, you know, and I see that now because partnering with CMPD, partnering with the sheriff's office to bring something to where we can bridge the gap, where we can have some type of understanding between the community and not just in the Black community, but, you know, I mean, you know, I just, when media put Black on anything, it catches wildfire, period. But, you know, trying to bridge a gap and create a relationship and the understanding between law enforcement and our youth today. Right currently, I have a nonprofit called Step Up to Leadership, where we focus on decision making, conflict resolution, and interpersonal skills and social development, social and personal etiquette, to where all of these things play a huge influence and role on how you interact with people, not just law enforcement, but with just people, period. But let's keep this thing on track. What this whole purpose is, what we're talking about, the justice system, law enforcement. I truly believe that you cannot train a person enough to have a heart, period. I don't care how many officers we put in the Black community. If it's not in their heart to have compassion, if it's not in their heart to have understanding, if it's not in their heart to want to serve that community, you can't make a person be what we want them to be. And I feel like you have to also look at that. We have to dig deeper in who we are giving these individuals these badges and this power, and how we are trusting them to go in these communities and to protect and serve. And so again, my experience is always something that I always rely on because I experienced it. I was beat up by police officers. I was shot by a police officer. I never was shot. I was shot at, by a police officer. I was maced by a police officer. And, you know, my whole thing is that everything, and I'm not pointing the finger, and I try not to blame people for my own mistakes and my own issues that I had. But I'll always be transparent to say that everything that I did, I cost on myself. Was it justified for me to have a gun pointed to my head? No, that's all in training. Um, but you know, there's ways we can go about things, and that's what I teach this youth today. To it don't take nothing but a second to think. You know what I mean? Think before we do things, think before we say things, think before we respond to things. Because sometimes if we make the wrong decision or choice, it can be detrimental. It can be life changing, or it can save your life. And so that's what I encourage every young man that I come in contact with. When we do talk about this stuff, like the law enforcement, when we do talk about the violence, when we do talk about the killings, you know, it's not just with law enforcement, with civilians, is the violence that we have in the communities today. I pride myself on letting them know about, you know what I mean, the effective results of communication skills, and how we try to show them that when you have effective communication skills, you either can learn how to listen without wanting to respond to things, as well as learning to talk with your body and not always with words. And so, man, I hate to sound like I'm all over the place, but you know, it's a sensitive subject, and it's not just one sided. And I think we got to look at it on two sides, and not just what law enforcement isn't doing. You know, again, I was a person who I was facing 24 years to life for attempted murder charge at 13. And so, but when you look back, you know, I feel like the justice system should have gave me more options, or could have gave me more options, knowing that this young man didn't have a fair shot or a fair chance coming up, and let alone this young man don't have support. And taking that whole thing into consideration to say, listen, let's see what other options we can offer this young man and try to save his life, let alone just try to throw him in prisons. And or just and hopefully that this sentence, that this 4 year sentence that we're going to give him, that he'll hopefully change his life around. But it didn't happen, because I came home at 17 with no resources, no help, no hope, and no structure. I went right back to the same environment, around the same people, with a different mindset, but just worse. So I got locked back up again at the age of 19, facing 35 years to life for another attempted murder charge that I committed. And again, it's me taking accountability of my own actions, me taking accountability of the decisions I made that caused me to be in the positions, in the situations that I got myself into. And those are some of the things that we got to take into account when you're selling drugs. You know what I mean? Again, I'm not just pointing a finger at the justice system. And I tell people this too, that I have programmed inside of Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office department or office, where I tell the inmates who coming home that, listen, we have to learn to stop now, because if we don't stop now, the chances are when you want to get your life together, people is not going to give you a chance. And we have to take that into account, you know. And so with me, I think when I had the resources, I didn't have the help, I relied back onto the streets. I put my focus back into what I knew best, is how to sell drugs and how to rob. And so it got me back in the same position, back in the same circumstances. But now here it is, I'm facing another life sentence. I ended up signing a 10-year plea. I did 7 years on a 10-year plea, came home, made a commitment to myself to change my life around. So that's why I've been devoting my time and efforts and energy on helping change the narrative in the young men today, because they need to see, hear, and understand from a person who lived it, experienced it, and has also walked that same path that they're probably walking or consider walking. So again, my whole thing is this: if we can help create a relationship with law enforcement, will be good. But we also have to understand, we have to help these people that's in these communities to bridge the gap between what they need to have in these communities, to create these programs within these communities. And I will always say that we can't rely on law enforcement or the justice system or the community or the criminal system to be the difference maker or to make a difference. We have to we have to have that weight on our own shoulders. So again, without that being said, man, I just feel like, you know, the law enforcement, the justice system, they have, it wasn't created to be fair from the beginning. We've been fighting this fight for many years, and we got to get the right people. We got to elect the right people, and we got to also hold ourselves accountable at the same time. So we can't holler about what police is doing when we ain't doing our own work in our own communities. And that's just being straight up and honest. Not to step on no toes. There's a lot of community leaders here in Charlotte. There's a lot of pastors here in Charlotte. There's a lot of people who can make a great difference in these communities. But we got to put this weight on our shoulders and make the difference ourselves. And I hate, again, I got so much going on right now. I came on a little late, but I just want to just say that much for the most part.
Brother Armstrong, this is Reverend Shipman. I want to say to you, first of all, appreciate your authenticity. I appreciate your transparency. I have to say, as a father, I have 26-year-old twins, and one is a young man. And I'm just grateful for the inspiration that you've given us. I hope it's going to make all of us better and better parents. When I listen to you talk about being beaten and maced and shot at, the trauma that not only you have gone through, how does this racial injustice and things that you have gone through, how is it still affecting your life even today?
And thank you for the question. I think with me putting myself in positions to be interactive with law enforcement, to have a relationship with law enforcement, it has given me a different perspective. Again, I was a young man who grew up with no guidance, no structure, no father figure. I didn't have no male role model. So the only thing that I saw was selling drugs and taking anything that you want, take it. That was something I was taught. So, I teach young men that if you're selling drugs out here, if you commit crimes, you breaking and entering, you robbing people, you're breaking the law. Law enforcement job is to stop those type of things from happening. So we got to, to me now, my whole view on law enforcement is kind of like somewhat different from a lot of people. Nico, she expressed herself as her son was killed by law enforcement. That is something that she would never get over. Her son is not here no more. She can't hug him. She can't talk to him. That is a trauma that she's going to have to live with forever, no matter how many law enforcement that can come in the midst of her, grieve with her, hug her. Her whole notion on law enforcement is going to be the same because one person made a decision and it caused a trickle effect with other people that's connected. So that's something different from me. I'm still alive. I changed my life. I make healthier choices now. And I realize that in order for me to make a difference, sometimes you have to connect and work with those who that almost, I won't say, well, like your adversary. As the streets would say, your ops. But those ops, those adversaries are human beings too. They have families too. They just chose this field as a career, and all of them really have a heart to make a difference. You just have some who just abuse it. So for me, Reverend, that I've changed my whole attitude and the way I view law enforcement tremendously. It was one officer, even though I've been beat up, maced, shot at by police officers, all these things, I had one officer who did embrace me. I had one officer at a young age did embrace me. But it was like, to me, I had to also come in contact with other law enforcement. And I remember like Gary McFadden at the time and Chief Putney, a lot of, he catch a lot of flack, a lot of people hate him, but I only can speak from a standpoint of what I got an opportunity to see from this man. And, he showed me his heart. He showed me, besides his position, his title, he has a huge heart for the community, but it's people like that I have positioned myself to be around to give me a different perspective on law enforcement. So I don't know if that answered your question, but my whole outlook on law enforcement and things that I experience is different now than it was then.
Yes, sir. You almost answered two of my questions at the same time. That's some of your heroes. But I got to ask one more question. I know we're a little short on time, Dr. Sadler, but as I was listening to your whole testimony, um, you claimed and you said that there were no resources that were really available for you when you came out. That was trying to rehabilitate yourself, and it sounds like now that there's an organization that you've even started, Step Up to Leadership, is
Sure.
acting as a resource now.
Mhm.
If there was something that you would change in Charlotte, and I hate to use the magic wand trick, but if there was something that you had the ability to change to make things better in Charlotte, what would that be, considering what your life experience has been?
Um, Direct resources, um, and not hidden resources. You know, some of these resources that is out here, and I can speak from my experience when I came home, Rev. There was a lot of rocks I had to try to lift up and look under. There was a lot of doors I had to knock. There's a lot of things that I had to do just to see what opportunity lies for me. And it makes it so frustrating and hard for young men, not just young men, but women as well, who's come from these prisons and they come back to these communities. They don't have the reliable transportation. They don't have the reliable means of people directing them. So when it's hard to find the resources, it makes it so frustrating and easy for those to go right back down the same road, down the same path, and reoffend easy. So if I had one wish, to make the resources more direct and visible for people, to where when they come home, you got from A to Z how to get back on track.
Dr. Sadler, I think even though I have about 16 more questions, I'm going to stop it right there. You've done a great job, Mr. Armstrong. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Roberts.
Yeah, so I want to, first of all, thank you, Archivius, for your amazing courage and your amazing self-awareness and awareness of a system that has, okay, I'm getting a little emotional. I'm a mom, so
Yeah.
these things happen. But your awareness of a system, one thing really hit me, and that is that you felt the system wanted to throw you away.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear that from other folks, and it is, and then you felt targeted and traumatized. You saw your mother dragged out of the house. You saw the system not giving any resources, not offering any opportunity, assuming that you were going to end up as a throwaway person. And I just, when I hear you now, and I hear you with the courage to take that trauma and turn it into something bright, shining, and inspirational. One of the things I ask is, how can we have more Archiviuses in the world? How can we teach other young people to have that courage, to have the ability to take something so traumatic and turn it into something so wonderful? I also heard you say there that finding a role model was hard, and that there was one police officer who befriended you and showed you that relationships were possible. And it made me think the power of one.
Yeah.
And how any one of us that's listening today has the power to change a life.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're changing dozens of lives every day. And again, as a mom, I really feel that we don't have enough youth programs. When I was mayor, folks would come and tell us about all these great programs they had for young people and how it helped keep kids busy and off the street and building good relationships. And we really, when you're an elected official, you hear the rosy stuff and you think, okay, great. We're meeting needs in a lot of places, and we're really not.
Right.
We're really not. And so your story is so powerful, and we need more people to hear that. There was something else that you said that is so insightful, and that is the responsibility of the media. And it is absolutely true that the media is part of this racial stereotyping. They are a huge part of it. And the way they depict people, the way they interview people, the language, the adjectives. And, you know, until you said that, I hadn't really thought about the degree of their responsibility, because they also pick on the conflict. So we don't see the stories of people like you who are doing amazing things and became self-aware and found good role models, and now you're sharing with other young men. We don't hear those stories. We hear the stories of the people who are in the cycle of drugs and crime and getting locked up. And we see the pictures of people, you know, with their hands behind their back in the jumpsuit. And that is part of the stereotype that people who look like me form from the media. And I just want to thank you for that. I think that may become part of our recommendations out of this, all these conversations, because that's something all of us have a role in.
Right.
And I could go on. I've got like 2 pages of notes about all the things I've learned from you. But I just want to say, sorry, I had to get up and Kleenex.
So,
I just want to say that as a former elected official and somebody who really deeply cares about our youth programs, I look forward to your help in figuring out how to fill the gaps and how to make sure that no young man or young girl, young woman feels like that society wants to throw them away.
Right. And I thank you so much, Mayor Roberts. And I saw you a lot. Never actually had an opportunity to have a conversation with you in person. But I want to take the time out to say this, and I'm gonna make it real quick, is that, you know, CMPD catch a lot of flack. They do. You know, they make mistakes, like we all are human, we make mistakes. We have pastors on here, listen, they're not the best, you know, they make mistakes. And, you know, I have to take my hat off, because CMPD have done a lot for me and my organization. And I pride on always giving acknowledgement to them, because every opportunity they get to highlight my influence and impact, they don't hesitate. I'm not a person who draws himself to the news or want to be on the news, want to be on the radio. I know the work that needs to be done in the communities, and I just go forth and just do the best that I can. But, you know, if it wasn't from, I'm gonna say it again, if it wasn't from Chief Putney, when so many schools here in Mecklenburg, CMS schools, wouldn't allow my programs in the schools, he found funding to make sure we have funding to get in these schools. When I had opportunities to have programs in different counties and families couldn't pay, Chief Putney found the funds to fund these kids to be in my program. When these officers saw me picking kids up, knocking on doors in some of the worst communities here in Charlotte, signing kids up, Delahaye Court, West Boulevard, it was CMPD Rob Trajowski, I forgot his name, who reached out to a person and they donated a brand new van. So I take my hat off, because I get to see and sit down with these men and truly hear their heart. And, you know, and it's not that they're doing things to pacify or to make themselves look good. These are some of the things they do in private. The media don't know, because they don't blow the whistle on what they do. But there are so many schools that couldn't fund or didn't have the financial means to allow my program to be in the schools. But when I went to Chief Putney at the time, he made it happen. And so, you know, and to have these programs like we have now, virtual program, we got an empowerment virtual program go on every single Wednesday. We got kids from Minnesota, we got kids from Atlanta, we got kids from different parts of North Carolina, as well as Mecklenburg. We go hiking in 2 weeks. I'm taking the kids on a fishing trip, and we're going to grill. And it's just like, these kids is 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. And it's all about building relationships. And, you know, and I have great friends who are law enforcement. Some of them are white, some of them are black. And I always say, listen, always interact with my kids out of uniform. Why is that? I want them to see that you are human beings. I want them to see you as people and not as a law enforcement, because if they see you as who you are, then they won't look at or stereotype you. So again, I want to thank you for this opportunity, the platform, Mayor Roberts, all the reverends, everybody who's on here. You know, just thank you. Like I said, I'm not hard to find. I would love to have this platform to share with anybody or whatever y'all have going on. But again, thank you for everything. Like I said, it's nothing but God that's directing this whole thing for me.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Armstrong, for your testimony and all that you offered us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Shipman, and thank you, Mayor Roberts, in this regard. Want to make sure that we bring on our next impacted witness this evening, Mr. Cedric Dean, who similarly has been impacted at a young age by the criminal justice system here in Charlotte. We're going to hear his story, and after he gives his story for, let's say, about 10 minutes or so, we'll have questions asked of him by by Reverend Glency Redrick, and a listening response, a hearing response by Mayor Jennifer Roberts. Mr. Dean.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today, and thank you for the work that y'all are doing to make a difference in our community. My name is Cedric Dean, and I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a single 18-year-old mother. After graduating from Hardin High School in 1972, the year I was born, my mother began working for the City of Charlotte Water Department. Because she was not making or earning a livable wage, she was forced to take upon a second job cleaning up office buildings, and then a third job as the church secretary, church clerk rather. But this allowed me to have too much free time on my hands, looking for a brotherhood that I did not have as an only child. At 13 years old, I was rebirthed into a new world of crime, drugs, guns, and violence. In fact, I had a short-lived stint as an armed robber and a drug dealer. By the time I was 16, I was arrested and placed inside the same cell blocks as adult killers, robbers, and rapists, 16 years old. Spent 5.5 years in a terroristic-like training. 11 months after my release in February of 1994, I was charged in a 6-count federal indictment for conspiracy to distribute crack cocaine. What I didn't know at the time was that there was a 100-to-1 ratio because of Lynn Bias had died, and the Reagan administration saw fit to make it an exaggerated response to say crack is this dangerous drug. So I decided, because I dared to argue that crack and powder was the same drug, because I had the nerve to exercise my Sixth Amendment constitutional right to represent myself at trial, to say that crack and powder was the same drug, I was sentenced to life plus 5 years. The judge said if you die and come back to life, you still got 5 years to do. Determined not to die in prison, I learned the law by reading every single law book available in the law library. I studied every single case that came out that had a direct or indirect correlation to crack cocaine. 7 years into my term, I was placed in a special housing unit, the Hole, where I was confined in a cell for 24 hours a day and endured the traumatic effects of being inside of something the size of your bathroom and having to hear voices in my head all day long. And it had the point to where, with a lot of free times on my head, I read an urban street novel called Be More Careful by Shannon Holmes, who had also served time in prison. I enjoyed the book so much that upon completing and reading it, I started writing a tale of my own called For the Love of the Streets, my first literary work, which was published in 2008. Subsequently, I wrote and published 19 more books from prison. Now, I would say that on the street, I didn't have the opportunity for somebody to reach deep down inside and discover that there was an author in me. They always just looked at me as a gangster. When I entered the literary arena in 2002, I had very little to look forward to, serving life without parole. Have I read books on writing and studying the style of established writers? I first enrolled in a prisoner-taught creative writing class. I completed that and went on to eventually teach a writing course of my own. Many people believed back then that I was not supposed to become a teacher and transform gangsters into gentlemen inside a prison. But I made a promise to the people who had helped me along the way that I would help others who were living like I used to live. Around 2004, at the age of 32, I took a teaching job at the United States Penitentiary Coleman in Florida. This assignment was pivotal. It introduced me to character education methods, to psychoanalysis, to activism. I served as the executive director of NAACP Prison Branch 5135. I also learned how to take direct action in being about social change. The work and experience with the NAACP were without question very significant in the development of my own ideas and direction. The staff culture behind bars perpetuated violence. Facility funding was based on the amount of disruptive conduct. The more violence, the more money. One education staff teacher put it this way: why am I going to help you rehabilitate yourself? The more inmates come back, the more job security I get. My early efforts to stop the killing and violence in federal prison focused primarily on testing and extending Gandhi's theory in relations to the effect of truth and love as supreme values of human psychology, with a strong emphasis on how society affects childhood maturation. This research entailed detailed social activism and awakened me to a doctrine of nonviolence and love, notably conducted in early 2006 while grieving members, and they was grieving because Stanley Tookie Williams had been executed while on death row, and they felt that it was wrong because he had done so much to try to reform the gang culture, but there was very little for compassion and remorse towards him. Well, 14 years into my incarceration, then we had a president by the name of Barack Obama, and we had a Congress that validated every single thing that I said at the age of 22 in that courtroom, and my life plus 5-year sentence was reduced to 35 years. And then 3 years after that, my sentence was reduced again to 27 years. And I subsequently moved to 4 different US penitentiaries, continuing my focus on prisoner welfare, and eventually expanded my concentration to child welfare, and also created Save a Child Month in 2012 to address juvenile delinquency, treat trauma, and mental illness. When the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting devastated America, I provided some key solutions to the surge in gun violence in my book, How to Stop the Killing, which I released on the 1-year Sandy Hook anniversary, December 14, 2013. Thereafter, I was awarded a lesser security transfer, but I continued my research and writing, leading the largest prisoner-led movement in America, Safeguard, Atone, Validate, Educate, SAVE. 2009, I founded SAVE with the objective of helping all young people with academic, behavior, and financial problems become job ready instead of jail ready. 1 year later, in 2010, I received the Federal Bureau of Prisons' highest awards, Call to Service and Civil Service Awards, wherein I became the first federal prison to receive that honor. In late 2015, retired homicide detective Gary McFadden wrote my judge and advocated for my immediate release. November the 29th, 2017, I was released immediately, and I started working for the Office of CMPD Chief alongside Detective McFadden. I served the CMPD's character education developer in CMS, having the honor of mentoring the most misguided middle and high school CMS students. I learned firsthand how real the school to prison pipeline really is. I learned firsthand about the implicit biases that were prominent in CMPD and CMS. I learned about CMPD's at that time 59 social programs. In 2019, after attending the State of the Union address, courtesy of Congresswoman Elma Adams, I collaborated with a technology company and launched a national replica of my program called RISE, Rehabilitate, Integrate, Stimulate, Educate. In closing, there is only one, and I say one, true way to stop the violence in Charlotte, and that's jobs. For over 400 years, in every election, we've said the same thing, jobs and justice. That's what we've been arguing for. In order for a drug dealer to stop selling crack, he must have an alternative means of making money. If I ask them, you know, the first thing they say, I'm trying to feed my family. Much of the violence in our city is a byproduct of the drug game. Unfortunately, women of color, Black women, are the greatest victims of the drug game. From drug trafficking to human trafficking, women of color are being treated like second and third class citizens right here on West Sugar Creek, right here on Bradford Drive. We must become proactive instead of reactive. And I say that to CMPD. We must become proactive. CMPD has only 17% of Black officers, 17%, which means over 80% of CMPD officers are white. No wonder why there is such a major disconnect with CMPD and the Black community. Thank you, and God bless you for the opportunity to share my piece.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate hearing from you, Cedric. And we're going to now ask Reverend Glency Redrick if she has any questions for you.
First, Cedric, thank you so much for just emptying and really putting a true light on our police system, our prison system, and the trauma and the impact of your experience. This is a difficult opportunity for me to ask questions. There really aren't too many questions to ask because you kind of told us your story, offered solutions to our problem. So I have one question that I think I want to ask, and then Mayor Roberts can affirm. And in looking at the questions that kind of to help guide, but listening to your story, you talk much about prison to from school to prison pipeline. You talked about mothers having to work more than one job in order to sustain their families. You talked about the reason that I call alternative ways of employment to feed families are the precursors for why many of us find our relatives, our friends in positions of law enforcement and then prison. So given all of that you shared, and even in your writing and even in the work that you've done, what solution or what question would you have for CMPD, for our court system, for our school system, that you would give to them to ensure that moms who are single moms having to leave their children in a latchkey environment while they go and work jobs that are not sustainable, what do you offer them as a solution? And perhaps direct your question and your thoughts primarily to communities of European descent? Thank you.
Thank you for that great, I say great question, because I'm actually working on a proposal right now as we speak, um, that would provide a wraparound solution to our entire approach at criminal justice. And specifically, it starts with a lot of the violence right now, and I can say this because it's public information, right? CMPD is understaffed. So the problem that they're having right now is that they can't be proactive. They have to be reactive. And they're lucky if they're able to just respond. So when it comes to stopping the killing that's going on, and there's a specific group, that 18 to 30 soft spot of individuals that we need to connect with. Now, majority, and CMPD will verify this, majority of the individuals that are out there committing, perpetrating these crimes, especially the murders, they have had multiple interactions with the police. And to Archivist's point, when they return to society, the resources are not in place. So what I am proposing to CMPD is for us to form a collaborative relationship, partnership with the business community. Because I truly believe that the solution relies in the economics of this whole situation. We have to get people jobs. And what I want to do is when they come into a Judge Lou Trosh courtroom, or when they go in front of that magistrate judge, I want it to be mandated that they contact Cedric Dean and his SAVE program, and we get with them and provide every single person that has an interaction with the criminal justice system with the resources that are available in this community, because I know where they're at. And the reality is there's a lot of great work being done in this community on islands. What we must do is bring the village back together. I know how to get an individual a voucher if he don't have nowhere to stay. I know how to get in touch with the transit system. I know the people to call to get him a bus pass so that he has transportation to get to work. I've been able to take an individual that was at the Mecklenburg County Jail when I'm going in there mentoring, and when he get out, take him and call to Blaze Pizza on South Boulevard and say, look, this guy right here just need an opportunity. I will co-sign. If you have any problems with him, I got his back. All you got to do is call me. So that piece is in place, and the police shouldn't be trying to do that. The 59, when people say defund the police, they're not talking about the security aspect. They're talking about the 59 social programs that CMPD has right now that can't do what I'm talking about. So what I want specifically for CMPD to do is to yield some of that social activism that they're doing, social work, and focus on these homicides. We have 1990 level homicides. We have churches, we have organizations, grassroots that could deal with this problem. And in closing, I want to say this. So when they come to Cedric Dean and the SAVE program, within 7 days, I want them to make the referral within 48 hours. But within 7 days, I will have a behavior modification plan in place. I will be able to get and provide actionable intelligence to the court system. Because once they get this, I know if you're not at work, because I'm gonna communicate with the person I get you a job with. And he's gonna let me know if you're not showing up. You're gonna have an opportunity. I'm going to connect you to a pastor shipman or yourself so that they could get that spirit. That's what safeguard atone. Atone is making amends for your past sins. We got to put God back in the equation. Jesus saved me. It was on my knees where I started crying out and say, Lord, if you just let me out, I'll go out there in the community and save your people. So we can't be afraid to say God and Jesus. And then the last thing, when they do that, I will communicate with the probation officer, with the courts, with everybody that's involved, and we will have an information sharing network so that everyone is on the same page when it comes to these people. And lastly, I will provide a progress report every 30 days to all of the people that are supposed to be in the process of adjudicating what's going on, from Spencer Meriwether to Judge Trosh to the pretrial release office, probation office. I will be that person that communicated, not just me, but people like me, because I can only bring forth what's in my head from being in the criminal justice system and say, this is what I know from firsthand experience will solve the problem.
Thank you so much, Mayor Roberts.
All I can say is, wow. No, I want to say a few more things, but I'm sold. Let's do it. Let's get to work right now. I want to say a few things about what I heard, because there's just incredible nuggets of wisdom. And, you know, when you talk about, I mean, you really understand the marketplace. And when you talk about the wrong incentives in our prison system, that the more violence we get more resources to, and that there's no incentive for our officers to reduce that violence. I mean, that is, you know, reminds me of our healthcare system, right? Just more treatment and you get more money. It doesn't mean they get healthier. So, you know, we are incenting the wrong things, and a critical look at that would be so helpful. I also heard the challenge, again, connecting young offenders with role models, with resources. I happen to know, you know, you talk about only 17% of our officers being African-American officers, Black officers. The same is true in our school system. We don't have enough teachers of color, especially male teachers. I remember working with a nonprofit called Profound Gentlemen that really built collaboration for Black teachers, because they didn't have enough support, because there were so few of them in the school system. So this is all about those jobs you talk about. It is about also the prejudice and the bias in our system that automatically thinks certain people can only do certain jobs. And I've heard this from friends. I've heard this from students who say, oh, my teacher told me I couldn't do that AP course. And these are usually students of color. Absolutely, they can. Absolutely, they can be authors. I love that you are. I was looking you up while you were talking. I've seen all the books that you've written. I can't wait to buy some. You're amazingly prolific. You've been featured in the Charlotte Observer. It's fabulous. The other things that I heard when you talk about Save a Child Month and the trauma, and how important it is for us to reach our young children early, because too many are witnessing trauma and violence at a young age. And you cannot shake that off. You cannot just go back to life as normal. You need counseling, you need professionals, you need help that we don't have enough of. So we need to recognize the trauma that so many young people are dealing with. And you talked about mentoring. We're hearing that as a real theme tonight. And it strikes me when we talk about jobs, we still have challenges, because I know when I was on the county and the city, we worked to ban the box, to say, you don't have to put in the first job application if you've served time, because it automatically rejects people who don't get a chance to explain themselves. And it's usually people of color. And so banning the box was a start, but there are still biases in the system for job placement and training and hiring that we need to work to eradicate. So I heard you talk about how important that opportunity for a job is in helping get people back on their feet. And I also heard you talk about how the police are partnering, and that we need business to do better at partnering. And so we add, you know, from our last conversation, we're adding media to who we need to talk to. Now we need to make sure we're talking to business as well, because they have the biases and the prejudice. And, you know, that Good Old Boys Network, people often give contracts to people they already know, people they're comfortable with, and they don't look to be inclusive the way they could. And there is so much talent and opportunity in our community. And you are like the epitome of talent and of someone who did an amazing thing in turning your life around. And when you were talking about solitary and confinement, I think somebody put in the chat that we should get rid of solitary confinement. It's traumatizing, it's horrible. I just thought of all the people who are getting COVID stir crazy. And I thought, oh my gosh, if we can't survive in our homes, I can't imagine being in a room the size of a closet or a bathroom without any out. So you are an amazing person. You are a gift to this earth. And I'm so glad I had the chance to hear you tonight. And I can't wait to read your books. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Cedric, for your story, for sharing it with us, and for the great work that you continue to do for the young people here in Charlotte. And hopefully your work will work with us to begin to transform what's going on. Thank you, Reverend Redrick, for your questions, and Mayor Roberts for letting Cedric know that we have heard what he had to say. The stories that we've heard tonight, the stories from Miko about an African-American woman who has lost her son to the system, the stories from Arcavius, and also from Cedric about what it's like to be an African-American man who's gone through the system, the difficult paths that they found to get there, and praise God, they've been able to make it through, but so many others are still struggling and don't make it. These are just a few stories that lay the background for the impact of race on people in this country. There's so many more that we have to hear, so many more that have to tell their stories, so many more voices that we finally need to attend to, that we might see what race does to us all. Our final witness tonight is a man that in some respects needs no introduction. Judge Lou Trosh is famous here in the city of Charlotte for the work that he has done over the years. He is about to tell a bit of his own story about his, dare I say, becoming woke. So let me, before I say anything else, I don't want to steal any of your thunder, Judge Lou Trosh. After Judge Trosh speaks, I might have a question or two for him, and then Reverend Greg Gerald will provide summary remarks for him.
Thank you, Reverend Sadler. And I also want to thank you for having me go after our incredible witnesses, Ms. McCarthy, Mr. Armstrong, and especially Mr. Dean. I feel like just dropping the mic, and based on what we've heard tonight, it was amazing. So I'm a judge here in Mecklenburg County. I've been a judge. This is my little green screen. I'm not really actually sitting in front of the courthouse right now. But that's where I work every day, and I've been a judge for 20 years. And you know, judges view ourselves differently. We take an oath to be neutral, right? We're the neutral people. And we've recognized probably over the years, or I recognized for many years, and I've been a judge now for going on my 23rd year as a judge. And for many years, I thought, you know, there are others in the system, because you can't be blind to see that the people that come into my courtroom are brown and black young men. You've heard the stories from Mr. Armstrong, from Ms. McCarthy and Mr. Dean about their experiences. And that's what I saw every day. But that, as a judge, that wasn't my problem. At least that's what I thought, right? That maybe that's the police, maybe that's the prosecutors, maybe it's the prison officials, maybe it's probation officers, maybe it's the legislators that make the laws, like the laws about crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. But after all, I'm a judge, and you know, our symbol is Lady Justice. So we're blind to bias, to discrimination. At least that's what I told myself for many years. And then I had some experiences, and one of those experiences really changed me. I was in court, I was in juvenile court, and I had two young men who were charged with an armed robbery. They were specifically charged with trying to rob a McDonald's here in Charlotte, in Matthews, actually. And I was scheduled to hear what's called a first appearance. First appearance, some of you may know, some of you may not know, is where right after you've been arrested for a serious charge, you go before the judge lets you know what the charge is that you have, what who your lawyer is going to be, and what you're facing, and then schedule another court date. In juvenile court, you also, because we don't have bail or bond in juvenile court, and so we set conditions of release or decide whether juvenile should remain in detention because this was in juvenile court. At any rate, I've got a lot of cases that afternoon. So I've got a lot to do that afternoon. I've got the 2 young men that are charged with the armed robbery and then a number of other cases. I figured it would be pretty perfunctory. Would go through the hearing and then move on. So I called the first case in. The young man came in from detention, as I expected he would be. Armed robbery is about as serious as it gets in juvenile court. And when I called him in, and he came in with the bailiff and sat down next to his attorney, a whole host of people came into the courtroom, his parents, his grandparents, some aunts and uncles, neighbors. The family had a stack of letters about this young man and how this was totally out of character for him. So I listened to what everybody had to say, and what I learned was that he and his co-defendant had watched this movie called Ocean's 11. Now, I'm old, I remember Ocean's 11. Some of you all may or may not remember it, but it's a movie about a heist that some people pulled on a casino, on an evil casino owner out in Las Vegas. So these 2 young men watch that movie and decide, oh, let's have our own heist. We don't have casinos, as you all know, here in Charlotte, but we do have a lot of McDonald's. So they go to the McDonald's, they try to commit this robbery, and it's an utter failure. They get arrested in the parking lot. So as I hear about the charge, and I let him know about his lawyer and what he's facing, I am now trying to decide whether or not he needs to remain in detention. I hear from his family how this is out of character. He's never been in trouble, never been suspended from school. His pastor from his church came to the court hearing. He was very active in his church. He was not gang involved. There was no history of drug abuse. He had very strong family connections, et cetera, et cetera. None of the risk factors that we typically see in juvenile court that lead kids to get into a lot of trouble. I wasn't hearing any of that. And so I said to the family, well, let me hear the recommendations from my team. And I have a court team that works with me. So I have a district attorney, I have a prosecutor, I have a court counselor or a probation officer that makes recommendations. I have case managers, and I have a defense attorney. And we always work together. So I asked their recommendations, and the court counselor said, well, Judge, we think that he may be eligible for our alternatives to detention program, which means if what the family's saying checks out, then we can release him on an electronic monitor with intensive supervision and a list of requirements. And so I said, okay, well, that makes sense. I asked the district attorney their recommendation. She agreed that that was the right thing to do. The defense attorney, I asked what they thought, and they said, well, could we just come back sooner, Judge? Today's Monday. We'd like to come back on Thursday instead of waiting all the way until next Monday, because if this checks out, then we want this young man to get back into school. And so I asked everyone if that was doable, and they all agreed that it was. So we scheduled the hearing for Thursday. So he leaves the courtroom, the family leaves the courtroom, I call in the co-defendant. I wait for the co-defendant to come out of detention. I wait some more for the deputy to get him out of detention. And I finally, and meanwhile, the families come in again, a mom, dad, which I often don't see in juvenile court, but mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, a coach from the school came because he was really active on the sports team at school. They had letters, they all came in. And I finally turned to the deputy, a little irritated, and said, can you bring in our other co-defendant? I've got a lot of hearings to do today. And he looked at me and said, Judge, there's nobody else back there. Well, yes, there is. The co-defendant, he says, Judge, there's nobody else back in the holding cells. And about that time, I noticed that one of the people that had come into the courtroom was in fact the co-defendant, the other juvenile. he sits down by his attorney and we go around. I hear more of the same information, ask for recommendations, same court counselor, same district attorney, same defense attorney, or I had a different defense attorney in this case, same case managers. And the recommendations were, Judge, we'd like him to stay on house arrest, to stay with his family, go to school every day, stay away from the co-defendant, sort of a standard list of pre-release conditions. And so I started asking questions, and I asked, you know, we just had the co-defendant and he's in detention. Was he the gunman? And I heard, no, they both had guns. And I said, well, was it the other guy's idea? No, these guys have been best friends since they were 7 years old. They live one street over. They watched this movie and they came up with it together. Well, did the other young man make threats, or was he the leader or did he threaten the police, or what's going on? And as I asked more and more and more questions, there is literally no difference between these two young men whose families were friends, who lived one street over from one another, who committed the same offense. Both of them they turned out to be pellet guns, we found out later, but you may or may not know that pellet guns now are not like Red Ryder BB guns. They look like Glocks or 357. So they both had weapons or pellet guns. They were both equally involved, and yet one was in detention and one was not. And the fact that probably everybody who's on this conference or call and commission hearing knows that one was white and one was black, and also knows that the white young man was with his family at home and the African-American young man was in a detention cell. And so I did at that point what Americans are taught to do when we look at a disparity or what appears to be discrimination. I looked for the racist in the room. I was trying to find Archie Bunker or Richard Spencer, the person who was intentionally trying to treat these two young men differently. Maybe it was the police, maybe it was a district attorney, maybe it was the court counselor, maybe it was another judge who signed an order placing the young man in secured custody. I was looking for who that was. And as I looked around the room, I realized, wait a minute, I work with all of these individuals every day. They're my court team. They're also not all old white men like I am. I had women, men, black, white workers, lawyers and case managers and court counselors, so people from all demographic groups. And I knew that they did not intentionally do this. They were trying to do the right thing. And as I asked the questions, I watched the light bulb go on over each of their heads as they realized, oh my gosh, we treated these two young men completely differently. And I realized something else was going on. And at that moment, I then had probably the scariest realization of all. How many times have I done the same thing? How many times have I, maybe not in a case that was this obvious, right? This was two young men doing the exact same thing, but maybe there was a little shade of a difference, or maybe it was two different times of the day. How many times have I treated unintentionally people completely different based on their race? And it brought me back to something that had happened a couple years earlier, well, 4 or 5 years before that, right when I came on the bench. So maybe it was like 7 years earlier. I was in abuse and neglect dependency court. And one of the attorneys, a very courageous and frankly, very kind to me lawyer, came to me and said, Judge, I'd like to talk to you. And she came to my chambers and we talked, and she said, look, I don't know how to tell you this, but there are some social workers that feel like you have different standards for families based on criteria that really doesn't have anything to do with the law. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, you have different standards for African-American social workers or Hispanic social workers than you do for white social workers, and likewise families, or at least that's what some people are saying. She said, I don't think that. I think you're a jerk across the board, but there are people that think that you are more difficult with some families. And I will tell you, as a white man, my reaction, I thought that outwardly I was calm, cool, and collected, listening respectfully. and responding respectfully. The reality probably was that I was very defensive, very questioning, and very ready to explain away why those perceptions were incorrect. Inside, I was feeling horrified, angry. How could someone think that of me? I'm not a racist. Because again, my experience, all of our experiences, if you are accused of, or if you treat people differently, then you're Archie Bunker, then you're a bigot. And that's all I heard was I'm a bigot. And I'm like, I've done everything my whole life to be neutral, to not be this way. I can't believe they must be wrong. These perceptions are wrong. That was my first thought. So we finished the meeting and I thought about it. I sat on it all weekend. And the next week, I asked the lawyer to come back out. We had some hearings and I asked between hearings to talk to her. And I said, look, clearly, just because I don't think I'm doing it doesn't mean I'm not doing it. My perceptions are not the only perceptions in the world. And clearly, something is going on where I am giving off a vibe, or maybe I am treating people differently without even realizing I'm doing it. Can you help me? And again, to her benefit and to my guardian ad litem attorney's benefit, both of them agreed they would be my tickler system, my warning system. And they courageously, kindly, compassionately to me would kind of let me know. And over time, it really helped me see that sometimes you make assumptions. I think Mr. Dean or Mr. Armstrong mentioned implicit bias. And so that led me and some other people to a long journey to try and figure out what's going on besides the bad cop kneeling on somebody's neck. There's something larger going on. There's a systemic thing that's going on. And I learned a lot, and we've learned a lot. So we started an initiative called Race Matters for Juvenile Justice and have gone on a long journey to figure out what is the court system's role? What is the school system's role? What is the police department's role? What is probation's role? What is the Department of Social Services role in creating these systems that either intentionally or even with best intentions, unintentionally treat people very, very differently? Implicit bias is one thing that we've learned about. Hiring practices is something else. You've heard a lot of the solutions that are ongoing tonight about economics, about opportunity, and it's changed the way I view my system. In fact, now what I recognize is, in order for me to treat people fairly, I have to acknowledge that I'm unfair. That if left to my own devices, I will have biases, and those biases will impact me. And my only chance to interrupt those biases is to recognize that I have them and then take active steps in order to mitigate or minimize those biases. So that's what I've striven personally to do, and judges in our juvenile courts and now across our court system are doing. In fact, we were just asked to present to all the Superior Court judges in North Carolina, and they had a similar presentation for district court judges about this concept of implicit bias and how it affects everybody, including Lady Justice and judges that are sitting in the courtroom. Nobody's really got a blindfold on, no matter how much we pretend that we do. I think I'll stop there, Reverend Sadler.
Well, thank you so much, Judge Trosh. It is always wonderful to hear this story and to know that you had an experience that helped you to see your role in a system that wasn't just, and then decided to atone for that, to find a way to make up and to help transform the system. First question I have for you is just a simple one. Were you keeping metrics about the way that people were experiencing the court system in terms of their race prior to that point? And if not, have you shifted your practices after that point?
Interestingly, you know, as history repeats itself, in the late 90s, there were some incidents with police officers and citizens that led to some unrest. And there was also a survey. You remember the recent survey about economic mobility in Charlotte's poor showing. Well, there was a survey about trust between races and ethnic groups in Charlotte in the 1990s. And I think Charlotte finished 49th out of 50 cities, of the large cities. And so that's where the initiative or the organization CBI comes from, for example, the Community Building Initiative. And so the court system did a survey in conjunction with CBI where we looked at how people were fared in the courtroom and their perceptions about how they were treated. And interestingly, people that came to the court system, and this is in the 1990s, felt like, no, everybody's treated fairly, but people that worked in the system, the bailiffs, the clerks, the lawyers, realized that people were treated very differently based on factors, race being chief among them. Since that time, one of the things that we've done with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice is look at our numbers and our statistics, both with regard to, for example, in juvenile court, who is going to detention? What do they look like? What are the crimes that they're committing? And to divide that out demographically, which used to not happen. And so we've made tremendous progress in keeping the data now, not just with the court system, but also with our stakeholders, our partners in the juvenile court system.
Thank you for that. And just one other brief question for you.
Yeah.
This has to do with the fact that you tried to change a fairly substantial system. Have you found that change is possible? Does the system resist? How have you found the possibility for systemic change?
Yeah, there's always resistance. I think what we did and what I'll give you an example real quickly. So the school system, for the first time, when Ann Clark she was active with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, and she was the superintendent for a period of time. And during that period of time, they brought up the school system acknowledged or talked about their discipline rates with respect to race and the disproportionality and disparities. And when they were prepared for that discussion, what helped her bring it up and have that conversation with the school board and with all school leadership was all of the rest of us, the judges, police, I believe Vicky Foster may have been there, or at that time it may have been, no, I think it was Vicky, but at any rate, the head of the Department of Social Services, Peggy Egan at the time, or was Youth and Family Services, our chief probation officer, we all came to the meeting just to sit there and say, hey, we're all looking at this too. And that strength in numbers when you're not just pointing your finger at one system. And I think that's really important because we've been talking a lot about the police tonight. And everything that you've heard is a problem that needs to be addressed. But it ain't just the police. It's employers, it's the faith community, hello, it's business, it is housing, it is schools, it is social services, it is across the health services. All of us do the same thing. The impacts are different. And for us, when our stakeholders recognized, hey, it's all of us, not just one of us, and we're going to not point the finger, we're going to point one finger at you, but we got 4 fingers or 3 fingers pointing back at ourselves. That's when we were able to begin breaking through some of those barriers. There's still barriers, though.
Yes.
Let's not kid ourselves.
Thank you so much. I couldn't have said it more eloquently than you just did. We have to examine each and every one of our systems to find out the way that they perpetuate these disparities, and then to begin to find ways to atone for what has been done. I appreciate that more than you will ever know. Reverend Gerald.
Let's see, Judge Trush, thank you. Rodney, you just said that we have to examine our systems, and Judge Trush, one of the things that you've done for us here is demonstrate that we also have to examine ourselves, and particularly as white people, as white men, working in systems that were designed to work for us and holding power within those systems. That self-examination takes some courage. It takes some courage because it sort of knocks down the world that was built around us where we thought we knew what was happening. And you've done that with a great deal of transparency and with a great deal of inward reflection. And so I just want to say thank you for that. for the way that you've exemplified that. I saw something come across in the chat. Someone else, I think it was Smitty Flynn out there, saying how grateful he was to hear that story and to hear a man from your social location to acknowledge all that and to demonstrate how the work is done. So we thank you for that. And so that's what I want to reflect back to you at this point. So that's what I have to say for now, Rodney.
Thank you so much, Reverend Gerald. Judge Trosh, Reverend Gerald, thank you so much for all that you've added to this conversation tonight. I want to turn this over right now to Dr. Sheldon Shipman for just his reflections on what we've heard tonight and what you think we need to do with all of this information that we've received.
Dr. Sadler, I have been overwhelmed and in a state of absolute awe at all that we have heard. This has been historic in a lot of ways. I just took some notes about from the opening slide, the opening prayer, your welcome, all of the various witnesses. We've heard emphasis put on words like the need for respect, cultural awareness, as well as cultural appreciation, healing from trauma and mental illness and stress. We even heard Brother Dean even said the word atone. It was in one of the chats. Need for jobs, need for justice. It's been down to mentoring programs, implicit bias and recognizing it both in the system as well as in our own personal lives. I can't say that this has been like an historic moment of sharing. I think this could not have been a better catalyst for the mission that this commission was formed to do, literally attacking and trying to deconstruct the concept of race. The most important word that I heard during the whole evening is one that I'd like to close out with, and that is the word where we need to value each other. And I'll leave that, I'll let that be my last statement after you give us, Dr. Sadler, your next steps as to what we need to do from this point, and I'll come back on that word value.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shipman. I just want to say, before I say anything else, that there will be a special session after this for all of the witnesses and panelists. If you'd like to have a conversation with Rabbi Mark Gopin to just talk about what you've heard, what you've experienced, and how it's impacted you. We want to make sure that we are taking care of those people who will testify and those people who will hear testimony as we go on. I also want to say thank you to all of the participants in tonight's first hearing. Our pilot hearing was a wonderful success because of the work of so many people, from Maddie and Aaron, who've worked with us as administrators, to Mark Gopin, who has looked over our shoulder as we've worked, to Reverend Glency, Reverend Dr. Shipman, Reverend Greg Gerald, and all of those who've sat on the panel this evening. I want to thank the first witnesses that we've had: Vicki Foster, Dr. Peter Wary, Cedric Dean, Archivius Armstrong, and Judge Lou Trosh. You all have added richly to our lives, given us much to think about, and helped us as we begin to think about and process the next steps. And those next steps are legion. We have a lot of work to do. We've only just begun this journey. We will process what we've heard today a little bit on Friday in the leaders meeting at 1 p.m. Those of you who are interested in coming, please just ask about a link and you can join us for that. I hope that over the course of the next week, we'll begin to think about what comes next in terms of hearings. I'd like to have the next hearing at the beginning of the new year and begin to think about how do we subdivide the work that we're doing into different committees, so that the various committees can look at different structures within our larger society. How do we examine healthcare? How do we look at education? How do we look at employment? How do we look at the various structures or systems within our larger society and determine what needs to go on, and then have hearings that look at each of those systems, and then have those committees go back and begin to work on plans about the way that we can provide redress to these various issues. So the work has just begun. Looking forward to what comes next. And thank you all for coming out today. Thank you all for participating and for being part of this initial hearing panel. As we prepare to go, I'd like to turn it back over to Reverend Dr. Shipman to say, my brother, please lead us home. God bless you all, and thank you for being with us tonight.
I'd like for everyone to unmute yourself and take your camera and make sure your camera is on. Since one of the most important words that we have heard tonight was value, there's a South African Zulu tribe term that I would like for us to just declare to each other. The word is, I'm going to tell you how to pronounce it. I'm going to tell you what it means. The word is sawabono. Sawabono. And what that word, just say that with me. Sawabono.
Sawabono.
That is a Zulu tribe term that literally means, I see you, I see God in you, you're important to me, and I value you. I see you, I see God in you, you're important to me, and I value you.
Sawabono.
Response, and the response would be, as we close, the response would be Shiboka, Shiboka. And Shiboka means I exist for you, we exist for each other. We certainly thank all of you, all of our participants. It's a wonderful beginning. May God bless all of you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next hearing that we have in our next steps. Thank you again, Dr. Sadler.
Thank you.
And all those. God bless.
Boca.
Shaboka. Shaboka.
Okay.
Shalom.
And shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
God bless.